Welcome back from coffee break. Now I have the pleasure to present our second keynote speaker and also last speaker before the panel discussion. It's Karen Archey, curator of contemporary art at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. And as I've said previous, the Stedelijk Museum has been important. It was important for Pontus Hultén, and we are still collaborating a lot between the museums. You have recently published this book, After Institutions, and that's also the title of your talk. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. I am very excited to be here, and I have learned so much about Pontus Hultén today, I have to say. I will not be speaking about him so much, but I will talk about the future of institutions and my thoughts around institutional practice. And I think that it's interesting to think about Hultén in terms of the creation of new institutions as a practice as we move forward thinking about the future. And also, you know, we can use that as a touchstone to how we relate to institutions today, but also being in a very different economic and social climate, as was just kind of noted in the panel conversation that we had earlier. And I just wanted to also add that as a curator of the past 6 years at the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, which is, I think, a very similar museum to Moderna Museet in its size and history and, you know, relationship to Hultén and Willem Sandberg, I also kind of feel like I've been working in the shadow and the history of Sandberg myself, who was the director of the Stedelijk from 1945 to 1962. And I don't know if this resonates with the citizens of Stockholm, but what I really notice about the legacy of Willem Sandberg is that the Stedelijk really is looked at as those being the halcyon days of the museum, where we want to kind of go back to and have that leading visionary figure. And it's also, I think, very difficult for all the kind of contemporary directors to live up to that really golden moment. So I also kind of want to add that in the backdrop of this conversation. And it's also really difficult to make that comparison because, again, the material conditions of creating institutions, creating exhibitions, funding institutions is just absolutely completely different than it was in Sandberg and Hultén's time. So things have changed, some for the better, some for the worse. So the question remains, how do we envision the future of institutions when we feel like they're almost kind of at the end of their natural life? So if institutions were born out of the Enlightenment, if they were projects that came to fruition during the post-war period when there was increased funding, what do we do now as we see in the advance of neoliberalism a decrease in public funding, where they've kind of transmogrified into something far from the structure from which they were born? And further, how do we speculate on futurity when it feels like our social, political, and economic backdrop is regressing into almost a distant past, in which our political climate is also one almost of feudalism, where all of the kind of collaborative partnerships politically that we see, for example, the EU and Brexit, is becoming, you know, more feudalist almost. How do we look at collaboration, international collaboration, and funding in that context? Yeah, so in order to think through some of these questions, I'll share with you some of my research for After Institutions. Thank you for having the book. That's so nice. I think it's kind of a difficult book to find. If you work with a small publisher, you'll realize it's like, oh, how do you actually buy the book and get the book? So thank you for finding it. And I'll also end with some thoughts on the most recent Documenta. I don't want to open a huge can of worms, but maybe a little can of worms. And we can think through also maybe how that could be a future model. Yeah, so the After Institutions project actually started as an exhibition that was researched for the Stedelijk, and it was supposed to open in October 2020 amid the pandemic. And it was canceled for various reasons that I won't get into. But then I transformed the research into a book. And that was published in June 22. And just to give you a very concise definition of the project, I would say that it seeks to reflect on two things. One is how we live and work within the context of our work as artists and arts professionals, and how we are to bridge art and life under conditions of precarity. So how are we kind of supposed to do our work, but then also not really have an easy time paying our bills, work under conditions of stress, financially, etc. And I was also really interested in investigating how the definition of institutional critique seems to be evolving and also increasingly relevant today. And a lot of people, I think, are talking about institutional critique also, as we saw in the other lectures today, but the kind of narrative of how we go from the 1960s, 1970s definition to today wasn't really clear to me, and also not for a lot of the people that I was speaking with. That included, for example, Margot Norton and Jamila James, who just organized the New Museum Triennial. Yeah, and I wanted to add a caveat that the images that I'm showing here, some of them are research images, some of them are works from the Stedelijk collection, some of them I just I don't know, that I just added. This is a work by Mario Garcia Torres. This is one of my favorite works in the Stedelijk collection. And it is in the Stedelijk itself during this long period of closure where the Stedelijk had to close in about 2003 because it didn't adhere to fire codes anymore. And they thought that this is going to be, like a few-year fix, and it ended up taking more like 9 to 10 years. And this was in 2007, and the artist Mario Garcia Torres came in with a group of performers, creating a kind of movement study in the institution itself, where they were bouncing off the walls and running and kind of creating these poetic actions. And then it's a slide presentation that we show at the museum. So I think it's interesting to see how it looks kind of dystopic. It kind of looks bombed out, but it was in a period of transformation. So within the exhibition, I actually wanted this to be the first work that you saw as a moment of kind of self-reflexivity. So I also felt like this research was coming out of a need. I was witnessing a lot of social justice movements happening, thinking about intersectional feminism, disability activism, anti-racism. These were all shaping the world, but then the way in which museums approached these topics sometimes was a little ham-fisted. So, it's somewhat easier to create an exhibition with, for example, an artist who makes work about physical accessibility to an institution, but then to make sure your lifts work and make sure that people in wheelchairs can actually access the institution is something completely different. And I noticed a huge issue, not just in the Stedelijk, but through institutions worldwide, that these were two very different things, that institutions were thinking about social change within the realm of representation and not necessarily within the material sphere. How do we change our workforce? How do we change our accessibility levels? So this is something that has very slowly begun to change. Yeah, so when you look at creating art in exhibitions, it's a practice that doesn't just depict, but impact life. I think that this renews really important conversations about labor conditions, other material realities, as well as issues relating to authorship, biography, privilege, etc. And yet, as an institutional curator, I'm also very aware how precarious institutions have found themselves in. So I will explore some of these contradictions and paradoxes in this talk. I also wanted to add a side note that this project is quite personal and meaningful to me. It's the culmination of years of research, and of course it's an emotional experience that the exhibition was canceled. And many of the topics of the book, thinking through feminism, financial precarity, labor rights, disability, are also issues that have touched my life personally and also of my loved ones. So I think it's really important to be transparent about these things, and also as an arts professional, in a professional context, to give space to this kind of intimacy. I think that you can sense this intimacy and maybe emotion in the book's introduction, which I wanted to read to you. It's an ordinary Monday morning in late 2020. Rummaging through the garden shed, I find a maquette of the east wing of the Stedelijk's first floor, covered with miniatures of institutional critique artworks and sprinkled with bird food and mouse defecation. Hans Haka's condensation cube is an empty fish tank fashioned out of jagged foam core and copy machine prints cut out by interns. Tiny photographs of ears fall off from the model walls and scatter across the clip art parquet floor. Back inside my living room, tote bags with travels from the past become receptacles for research books no longer needed. It's been about time. The library wants them back. My partner shoves me into an Uber XL with the books and maquette headed to Museum Plain, where security guards donning face masks help me fumble into the Stedelijk. I exchange the Shadon maquette and library books with folders containing my project documents for my own archive. Who knows, maybe this isn't all for naught. I walk out of the museum to find a lone hot dog seller and a gigantic Claes fountain the size of a small building. A pink tram advertising the private Moko museum next door, Basquiat, Herring, Hearst, Kunz, Kansama, Warhol, and more, rolls up to Museum Plain. I step in. It's meant to be funny. Some of my colleagues were like, whoa. But it's also, the rest of the book is not like that. The rest of the book is like actually written in the vein of art criticism, and to some extent it's, art historically sourced. But I think that it was meant to kind of sketch the feeling of that backdrop of how museums in a neoliberalized Western context are functioning today. But I wanted to move forward by sketching out what the current state of art institutions is as I see it. And I think that the crux of the project also is that I find museums existing in a paradoxical state, which on one hand, their existence is threatened by economic pressures, political pressures, operational pressures. On the other hand, they really need to change. They have collections that are, let's say 94% made by or exclude women, people of color, people living with disabilities. The staffs are overwhelmingly white. And there's nothing wrong with being white, of course. It's just that institutions as public entities, I think, can have a more representative representation of their populace. So these economic conditions are also exacerbated by COVID-19, decreased ticket sales. You can also see that, for example, with the Tate. The Tate had a massive series of layoffs last year. I think that they lost something like 30% of their workforce, going from about 1,000 colleagues to 700. And then you also see in the United States the massive selling off of their collections. This is a historically unprecedented moment in which the Association of Museum Directors has actually lifted a ban on deaccessioning and has said that they will not impose any restrictions on the deacquisition of works for the purpose of raising operating funding. So this is absolutely incredible. And even in the Netherlands, this has been raised in the city government to discuss whether or not the museum should be forced to sell its Roy Lichtenstein, which could potentially drum up 50 million euro and bail out the entire cultural sector of Amsterdam. Luckily, that did not happen, but it was debated on the government floor. Also, I would say on a political level, it was also mentioned today earlier that, for example, in Russia, there has been political appointments in other countries that are having a rise in nationalism and populism. Poland, Brazil, Hungary, China, Hong Kong are all increasingly either censoring artworks or removing museum directors and installing political appointees. So museums are very much at risk just in terms of being able to operate and care for their collections. And on the other hand, most museums are the products and inheritors of pretty problematic histories and really desperately need to change. And evidence of this is pretty omnipresent. For example, at the Stedelijk, we have 6% of the works in the collection are made by women. It's just an incredible statistic, and it's a 100,000 object collection, and that begs the question: how do you make progress in that statistic? What do you do? Are you going to acquire 50,000 objects? With what budget? So this is also a bit of a kind of existing issue, and as market prices rise and rise and rise, it's really, really a quagmire for us to think through, how are we going to get out of this? How do we create a more representative collection? And then further, this is something that I'm thinking about personally, but if you specifically make acquisitions in order to diversify your collection in terms of representation of women, people of color, people with disabilities, how do you evade tokenism in that sense? What is a meaningful way to engage artworks that evade this kind of biographical reading? And so I think I mentioned that this lecture is meandering a bit, so I wanted to meander a little bit toward biography. I'm really fascinated by the topic of biography and the usage of biography in institutional practice. And I think that how we treat artist biographies and biographical information in general has seen a meaningful evolution over the past years and decades. I think that this is because we're seeing a continued need for artists to make work from their own subject position in order to showcase lived experience that not necessarily is seen in the canonized works within major institutions. And I have some core questions surrounding the use of biographical material. So how do we bridge the divide between the personal and the professional in a meaningful way that protects privacy, but also opens up readings to live experience? And when exactly is biographical information relevant in the context of an exhibition? When do I need to know, for example, that someone identifies as transgender? When do I need to know that someone has experienced chronic illness? When do I need to know that an artist is a person of color, et cetera, et cetera? And my thinking right now, maybe it will evolve, is that I would argue that this information is only relevant when it is crucial to understanding the artwork itself. And this is also something that I think that should be done in conversation with artists, and to consult them, because the institution is by nature a public space. So you don't want to out someone and include information about their personal life when you don't have permission to do so. I would also just add that if you look back at art history, Archey the art historian Archey wrote a really, really amazing essay called, I think, Minimalism and Biography in 2000. And she writes about the uneven treatment of biography between artists engaged in minimalism, specifically looking at the white man as a universal subject. So Donald Judd, for example, as we see here, Carl Andre, for example, their work was analyzed in terms of its aesthetic potential, its conceptual ideas. But then other artists such as of that period, Hanna Wilke, Eva Hesse, Anna Mendieta, all of their work was actually more seen in the lens of their illness or their death, so biographical details. So yeah, I wanted to talk a bit more about institutional critique. As I mentioned earlier, I think that institutional critique is increasingly relevant today because it connects the investigation of materialities, material realities within our primary field of activity within the field of art itself. And I frequently have been seeing young artists employ strategies born out of early institutional critique, and I began to wonder whether or how you could connect these more contemporary practices with historical institutional critique. Even though they function in quite similar ways, they do look quite different. So I'm not going to go too much into the history of institutional critique or the waves as I see them, because I don't think I have time, but I also want to focus on I want to zoom in on one aspect of institutional critique that I think is foundation to understanding the similarities and differences with a more open reading in the contemporary practices that I'm thinking about today. This aspect is specifically the rejection of visual primacy in contemporary art. So this was a primary focus of conceptual art, of which institutional critique is an offshoot. This is something that extends back to Duchamp's ready-mades, which art historically is often considered among the first moments in which the primary apparatus of an artwork is not how it looked, but the conceptual ideas behind it, to put it simply. And for example, as we see here, Mel Bachner's exhibition, Working Drawings and Other Visible Things on Paper Not Necessarily Meant to be Viewed as Art, held at SVA in 1996, exhibited ideas on paper with absolutely no visual element. 2 years later, in '68, Seth Siegelab published his famous Xerox book, which is an exhibition in the form of a book. And so this turned toward a purely conceptual presentation, and in this case, a purely textual presentation, placed the realm of ideas over the visual, and as such challenged every preconceived notion at that moment of how to experience artwork in a gallery, and also how to collect it. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to be using this thingy. So in Lawrence Wiener's removal works are interesting in this context and extend this into the gallery space itself. So for this piece we see here, this removal piece, he extracts a portion of a rug from the gallery space and places it on the wall. And this is thought to have a kind of conceptual purity because it adds no additional visual material to the aesthetic experience of the exhibition, but rather references and uses only pre-existing material in the gallery itself. So this action both challenges the purported need for visual presentation in artwork, but it also opens up the content of the work to a reflection on the exhibition space and the institution itself. So beginning with the site-specific nod toward the institution's architecture, Wiener critiques the metaphorical and literal institution, both the set of socially prescribed rules governing artistic practice and the set of political and economic forces that determines an artwork's value. So I think that this is an interesting shift from conceptual art to institutional critique. And so going on to Andrea Fraser, and maybe a later moment of institutional critique, she was working decades after Bachner and Wiener, but was instrumental in putting the framework of institutional critique into words. I think it was also mentioned earlier today that the word institutional critique didn't even exist at the time when Bachner and Wiener and Britton were actually practicing. But it was actually coined, I think, in like 2005 or around the millennium by Fraser herself. So she was part of this group of artists based in New York, primarily in the late 1980s and early 90s, that could be considered a second generation of institutional critique artists, including Greg Borderwitz, Tom Burr, Mark Dion, Zoe Leonard, Renee Green, Fred Wilson. And of course, this is the exact moment of the AIDS crisis, which brought with it a sense of social urgency. And I think that this quote by Greg Borderwitz, who's a former professor of mine, is really important. The kind of work that I do now doesn't necessarily address issues of institutional critique directly, but it does indirectly. I have no more questions about gallery walls. The kind of academic understanding I used to have about institutional critique led to a dead end. It ate its own tail in its formalism. What seems useful to me now is to go out and to do work that's directly engaged, that's productive, to produce work that enables people to see what they're doing, that enables them to criticize what they're doing, and moves on. I was also lucky enough to have a series of conversations with Fraser that really influenced my thinking on institutional critique, though I disagree with her on quite a few things. And so what I think is most important to Fraser is this idea of the anti-aesthetic strategy. And one could understand that anti-aesthetic strategy as rejecting visual primacy in art making, specifically criticality toward the creation of commodities for the art market. This is a lengthy quote again, sorry, but I'll get through it. So this is a quote from a conversation that I had with Fraser recently that's published in a book by Frans Hals Museum. Conceptual art influences are certainly important to how I understand institutional critique as an artistic practice. And the most important component of that for me is the anti-aesthetic critique of the art commodity. That is something that seems very rare in the work of younger artists today. While many younger artists seem eager to engage in a critique of museums and other aspects of the art world, the critique of the aesthetic and of the cultural commodity seems almost entirely dead these days. There are a lot of artists who take up various kinds of politics that relate to art institutions, but I don't see attacking institutions or board members as if from the outside, the righteous position of the dominated victim is institutional critique necessarily, even though it might be a critique of the institution. This goes back to my understanding of institutional critique as a practice of critically reflexive site specificity. It is not just about them, those people with power, the donor class, those neoliberal and plutocratic institutions. It's also about us, the donee class, who supply those institutions. We are not victims of the art system, but active, eager participants, and its reproduction depends on your participation. So this is really emblematic of Andrea Fraser's thinking in terms of the fact that we are the institution. But at some point I began thinking, okay, if we are the institution, who is we? Who is included in that? And is that an inclusive we? So if you look at the second wave or the artists working in the 80s and 90s, you'll see, for example, Greg Borderwitz working through documentary video. This is his work, Fast Trip, Long Drop, on the screen, which chronicles his life as an HIV-positive man living with AIDS during the AIDS crisis. And similarly-ish, Zoe Leonard's work is on the right. This is a bunch of desiccated fruit that she had been sewing together in the wake of the death of her friend, the artist David Wojnarowicz. And she installs it scattered around the gallery floor. And it's a metaphor for the body being ravaged by AIDS and left behind by society. And even though this work, it's very object-based, might seem to not fit into Andrea Fraser's definition of the anti-aesthetic strategy, you could see it as a critique of two institutional systems. One is the ephemeral nature of the work, which is resistant to conservation intervention challenges and the collecting function of the museum. And secondly, I think that Leonard is looking at the medical industry as an expanded site. So this is a moment in which the institution is not just the art institution, but it's actually something more broad. And this was a very core kind of concept in my thinking around institutional critique. I kind of just this morning finished this presentation. I added this term pro-aesthetic strategy, which is not an actual art historical category, but I thought it was kind of clever. So you can see, so Leonard is thinking through these things, but then I thought about, works by artists like Derek Jarman. I'm absolutely obsessed with Derek Jarman. He's brilliant. He was someone who, was also HIV positive, working during the AIDS crisis, but he was also making paintings. This painting is called Margaret Thatcher's Lunch. Come on. He's just super funny, but then also making work when he's actually dying. So I see this bravery in this work, and it's absolutely important work. And he also had some really great media moments. For example, he was on the news being quoted about some anti-Thatcher legislation or gay legislation that was put forth by the Thatcher administration. And he said, being gay is a blessing, but because of society, it can be a real problem. His best known work is the piece Blue, which is a feature-length film with only one static frame of the color blue, and there's a soundtrack that goes along with it. And this is the last feature film that Jarman ever made before his death from AIDS-related illnesses in 1994. And it chronicles his life as a gay man living in London and dying of AIDS in the 90s. The work is actually the exact shade of International Klein Blue, which he had seen at the Tate in 1974. And he was interested in the associations of IKB with the void, the sky, spirituality as he was dying. And it also has a very personal meaning for Jarman because as he was going blind, blue was the only color that he could see. So what I find really interesting about this work is that, Jarman absolutely loved working through objects. He was all about adornment. He was all about painting. Even when he couldn't paint anymore, he was making paintings by giving instructions to assistants. They're incredibly emotional. But I also think that he's extremely conscious of capitalist systems and works within them and takes advantage of them, specifically the media environment, as much as it can be taken advantage of. I think there's also something very interesting about the minimalist gesture within this work, and specifically thinking through the critique of phenomenology. So this is a minimal piece that a blind man is looking at. And I think that within a few of these works, also, for example, this next work Park MacArthur, this is also a minimal piece. And if you think about the legacy of minimalism, you are supposed to look at a work and have a specific aesthetic experience of it based on a purported phenomenology. However, for example, if you sit in a wheelchair, you're going to have a different phenomenological experience from someone who is standing. If you're blind, you're going to have a different phenomenological experience from someone who is seeing. And I see that this is a bit of a theme in the works of artists working more recently. So just to briefly touch on one artist that I would say is a kind of contemporary institutional critique artist. I don't know how I'm doing on time. Am I late? Okay. Okay. So this is a piece by Park MacArthur. She's a younger artist. I mean, younger meaning like 35, 40. But I think that this is a really interesting piece because it brings together access ramps that she had needed to be built for her to access various institutions where she either had a residency or an exhibition. So the artist is a wheelchair user, and otherwise she was not able to enter these institutions, and they're culminated here in this kind of minimal fashion. And I see references to, example, Carl Andre, or also Wiener, taking something out from the gallery space and putting it back in. But then also MacArthur in this work went a step further, and she created a Wikipedia page for the disability activist Martha Russell and printed it on the wall, which you can't see in this installation view, but it was a very, very big wall-filling URL. And I think that this is kind of emblematic of what you could call a third wave or a new approach to institutional critique, in that it's thinking about access institutions and also this kind of more socially engaged element in terms of social justice. I wanted to zoom out and consider what's at stake here with all of these works and practices. So Fraser's thinking on the anti-aesthetic strategy also echoes her generation's critique of gallery-ready practices. So the curator James Meyer, in his seminal text of institutional critique, What Happened to the Institutional Critique, which was also kind of hilariously an exhibition at a for-profit gallery, he writes about the contradiction of works by artists such as Barbara Kruger and Byron Kim that purport a politics, but they also seamlessly fit into the art market. So I notice a total rejection toward working within the structures of capitalism, and this has almost kind of become a doctrine or a lifestyle for these second wave artists working in the 80s and 90s. And I understand it because to this group, institutional racism, misogyny, failures of the state and the AIDS crisis are all byproducts of capitalism. So to eagerly participate in the art market is to also support the system, so thus they try to evade it. But so what does that mean today? Can we do that? And I think that there's a very important text by Danielle Buren. There was actually, okay, so there's like a lot of really good Google image search options for like the end of capitalism, but so that's what that image is. But so Buren's text on institutional critique, which is the artist studio, I'd mentioned this in Fraser's quote, was that the space of the artist studio can be critiqued as a site of the architecture of capitalism. But if you think through that, now it's like, so do you not work in a studio then? Like, do you not actually make objects? Like, and if you think about, I think about my friends who are artists, and if I would suggest that they would not work in a studio for ethical considerations, they'd be like, you're fucking crazy. And like, if you have a studio, that is such a privilege, to the point where it's like, not very many artists have studios anymore. So it's a kind of open question. How do you relate those ethics and those politics with a contemporary condition? And so I see the past, specifically second wave, first wave of institutional critique as trying to reject living and working within capitalist structures. But I think that the goal of institutional critique is also to try to make sense of a material reality and try to meet art with life, and to have a complete rejection of working within capitalism seems almost untenable at this point. And that's why I add this famous Mark Fisher quote, "It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." So I'm almost done. I wanted to wrap up by briefly talking about an exhibition experience that I think totally bypasses these problematics, and that's of Documenta 15. So there's a lot to talk about, but I'll only go into one specific aspect and one specific installation. How many of you guys saw Documenta 15? Raise your hand. Okay, I'll be descriptive. So basically, I don't think Documenta 15 went to reject capitalism or think through how to support and diversify inclusive collections and stuff like this. They just kind of totally went a different route. There was just a more celebratory approach, showcasing practices that really bring together art and life. And in the gigantic building of the Fiducianum, on the ground floor, I was just kind of moseying around, looking at stuff, and I was like, oh, I'm in a workshop room and another workshop room and then another workshop room, and there's drawings from children and there's some kids hanging out, and great. And then I started to realize that as you continue walking through, there's a very specific museological presentation on toys and different toys that have been developed by the Hungarian pediatrician Emmy Pickler, and also literature related to Montessori learning in vitrines, and then some of them were kind of available to take. And then I went a little bit further, and then there was a whole functioning daycare. I'm a fairly new mother, so I was just thank God, whoa. Maybe I could even be with my family and see this exhibition, which to me is completely revelational. And so, yeah, this is a picture of the daycare. And then you kind of go a little bit further. Next to a diaper changing table, it's very well designed, there's a little cave where there's a video theater. And then you see this video by Graziella Kunsch, which is called, I don't know how to say it in Portuguese, but I think it's called Free Movement. And it's Free Play. And these are recordings that the artist made of her daughter's free movement, her motor development. And they almost kind of look like there are titles like Baby Looking at Hand or Baby Attempting to Roll Over. And what I found really, really beautiful about this is that I think that this kind of came from a history and a realm of high art or autonomous art, where there's a clear knowledge of conceptual practices, a history of video art, and also kind of function, like a movement study and 1970s videos. So I think that what for me was completely revelational about this experience is that art could be seen as a variety and a scale of different experiences that went from being practical and useful to also representational, all at the same time, but it also fostered a viewing experience that was inclusive. Would it be inclusive for people who normally may not be able to go to large winding exhibitions like this? So, to wrap up, Hultén. I think it's really interesting to look back at. I had a lot of questions for the last panel, I have to say too. But I think it's really interesting to look back at Hultén and think about how curatorial practice has changed, how museological practice has changed, and also how that might be changing from a role in which one person isn't of a kind of visionary primary importance anymore, but actually a more collective experience, a more social experience, thinking about the viewer could also be the way forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Karin, for leading us through institutional critique in a very good way. So please now, I would like the panel to come here and take your seat.
I'll go in the middle.
Håkan.
Oh, yeah.
Ska inte du sitta i mitten?
Okej. Okay.
And as our moderator, we have invited Håkan Nilsson, here, left to me, professor in art history at Södertörn University, and also for many years art critic in Svenska Dagbladet and Dagens Nyheter. So, Håkan, the floor is yours, together with all
Together
with the panel and all the speakers that we have listened to today.
Yeah. Okay, such a great panel. It's difficult to see how I can bring anything to this. But I've been when I'm going through your lectures and talks, I've been thinking that there's at least two different themes that we've been talking about. One is obviously Pontus Hultén and the character he is and was, and the kind of curator he was, and also, of course, the idea of the museum and what the museum is and it could be, and how these two interact, and possibly also a third one as an art historian. I can't help thinking about the art historical dimension of being a curator and how Pontus Hultén is kind of seen as Claes said, kind of the pop art curator, but also, as we know, very much into art historical practices. And maybe that is a strand that we kind of have as in a reserve. But I was wondering if you could, start to talk about the Pontus Hultén. Is he a historical character, or would he be possible today? And so my first question would actually be to you, Gitte. Would you hire Pontus Hultén?
Well, I think he would go for my job. Yes, I would, because I think of course, being a museum director as Moderna was there, the first thing that pops up in your mind is the legacy of Pontus Hultén. Both because he was defined for this particular institution, but also because he was, he was really redefining the role of the museum in society. And I think what I'm working in my position today is the interface with the public, the way that art interacts with the public. How we as museum, we are defined by being a public domain in a broader sense. And this corps du miracle that he mentioned in an interview that I read about his idea of a future museum, this we should try to translate into our own time. And I think that's why I would hire him, because he was as I see it, extremely curious in how art met the public. And that's why he was focusing on what is the idea of an exhibition, what possibilities do the tool as an exhibition is, what possibilities do we see in that specific form? And that's what we are continuously working on today. If you go to our Nan Golden exhibition right now, you will see an exhibition that also challenges the format of the exhibition, but also works intensively with the artist. So yes, I would hire him, and then
you would hire him.
Probably go for my job, and I won't have my job anymore.
You will look for a new job very soon afterwards. Well, Claes, Britton, you have been writing a lot about this character. How would you say? Is it possible today, or?
No, that is something that of the many people I have met around the world, so many have said that Pontus is as totally impossible character today in the art world today. Like a total, people have used like a total anachronism, and I mean they would just look at him and wonder what is this, you know, and that. I think for many reasons. I mean that as was mentioned here before, the material conditions, of course. I mean everything was much smaller when he started, and you could go under the radar and do things, and also of course this more patrialistic structure that was then that you could be, even though Pontus was involving always other people in the groups and collective, he was always like, he was never afraid to take the decisions by himself and change his mind and do this and now we do this. I was talking to Mette Pravitz here, for example, who was very important when they started the children's department here in '64 in a small way. She came to Pontus and said that there was a provincial museum that had a children's department. It said it was a shame that a provincial museum should go before Moderna Museet. And Pontus said, yes, okay, we do it. And the next day, there was carpenters there building a wall and opening a small children's. I mean, these kind of decisions he could make, and he did all the time. I mean, this is just impossible now. And I mean, the huge change that came, that was in the 80s when the money came in, and also the trends came into to the art world, and that very comprehensively changed it, and the institutions grew, and so I mean, absolutely impossible, I would say. Wouldn't you say, Jean-Hubert, that Pontus is?
Well, things have, it's true that things have enormously changed in the last 50 years, you know, and what you describe is absolutely true. And well, when you go for the scale of the Moderna Museet to the scale of the Centre Pompidou, you're in completely another world. Yeah. But we have to make the difference between what is now called industrial culture and some small institutions. So I think in small institutions, some guys can still do incredible things. I believe in that. It's not. We shouldn't just say, well, it was so nice in the past, but that past is over. And no, there are also always many possibilities.
Yeah, but I mean, yes, but I mean, an exhibition typically in that time was produced in big exhibition in like 1 year or less, like 6 months or that. When now it's to produce a big exhibition is like 4 years, 3-4 years. I mean that.
So what you're saying basically is that he is impossible because of the situation is much different than it was when he was. What made him possible? Annika, could you say something about the situation during the 60s and what do you say is made Pontus Hultén possible?
Well, it was both this open situation and the patriarchal structure was still there. So it was not only in the way that the authorities and the government gave the possibility, but also the framework of the actual situation, as we were talking about, for example, on, I think you mentioned Andreas Horn, was made through a material situation where he could be sponsored by his partner Lena Wihlbom's connections, which donated a lot of money, and it was also a situation where I think we have to consider that when three artists and a museum director play together, they are not on the same. There is something going on in between them, so on. But that was a situation which was taken very well care of in a fruitful way by him. But I think it's important that we acknowledge the fact, the history then, how it was.
Would Pontus Hultén be impossible if he was a woman, for instance? Marta, or
not then. No, no way.
Well, given the social context of who had the privilege of being a PhD student at the art history department in Stockholm, getting the professor's attention and getting the PhD scholarships, I would say you just have to look at the statistics, and I would say no. No. It was a male thing.
Yeah. So the situation is both open and closed at the same time in such sense, at least. Well, Karen, you were talking about the kind of new institution or rethinking, and what we say is that Pontus Hultén will call you up and say, I really love your ideas. I would help you if I can. What would you reply? Thank you. No, thank you, Pontus Hultén. We don't need you.
Oh, like if like if I were to make a new institution and Pontus Hultén was like, "Yo, what's up? We wanna."
Yeah, something like that. You're giving the ability. You're giving the possibility to reframe the Stedelijk totally, but you have to take Pontus Hultén on the train.
Oh man, if it was like a resurrection and then
that required that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I love talking to people who have historical experience in creating institutions because it's such a specific task. You know, like starting something new is just very, very difficult. No matter what you do, even a program within an institution is difficult to start, to be able to communicate between many departments and get people on board and informed and enthusiastic, and there's a lot of experience that comes from that, for sure.
Kim, would you say that Pontus Hultén's ideas resonates with what Karen has been talking about?
Well, I think so. Let's see. Let's see. Well, what I tried to sketch out in my presentation was a sort of divergence between two tracks, in a sense, where historical sort of lineages, in a sense, where on the other hand you have this sort of U.S. created institutional critique genre, which to a large extent relates to the institution of the museum negatively as a set of limitations. And artistic practice then becomes either the ideal becomes either to reveal those and exist within a structure where that somehow can be held accountable for them, or else transgress them completely in favor of some sort of more or less utopian idea of art merged with life or something like this. And this kind of model where the institution figures as a set of limitations, as a negative definition, does not really account, cannot really be used to account for the kind of institutional experiments, I would say, that Hultén was involved in together with this whole group of people. And I think this is fascinating because, in a sense, the Kulturhuset experiments, the information center projects, and also, I mean, the early phases of the Centre Pompidou project, they responded to a different idea in a sense. They responded to the idea, to the question, let's say, how could the sort of public cultural institution be a vehicle for extending democracy and autonomy? So rather than seeing it as something negative, as a set of limitations, it was something that could be employed in order to extend new possibilities to other social fields and so on. So there are intersections and clear connections between these traditions, especially as the tradition of institutional critique evolves and becomes second generation, third generation, and so on, and the whole thing becomes modeled. But still, there is a sort of there is a fundamental difference there, and I find it personally more interesting to think in this other tradition of seeing what could, if we try to think the cultural institution as somehow an apparatus of democracy and autonomy, what would that be? That's something that I find that I draw more energy from than Hans Hacke's famous works from the late 60s or something like this.
Thank you. Andreas, as an artist, you have been also working with kind of institutional critique as yourself. How would you think that Pontus Hultén would respond to your projects?
Oh, I have no idea. Actually.
No?
No.
Try to find some?
No. No, I have no idea, actually. And I think there were some interesting things said about institutional critique earlier, so I won't repeat them. But something else that struck me in relation to your questions here, that is totally banal and said in different ways, but we tend to forget to stress that in the 60s there were a future, and now we're looking back to that future. And when you ask what Pontus Hultén would think today, the blunt answer is he's not here today, because the 60s was a huge wave, and he could surf. And that was the trick also. Imagine what happened in the 60s. I mean, I often think about the Beatles or something. Like 6-7 years, they did something that today takes maybe 20 years, in a way. So it's over. And he was a very perfect example of what could be done at the time. So that's my point, and I'm not a part of that time, so I can't really connect to.
No, for sure. No, but so then what we're doing here is talking about the person as a character, as a historical character. That. But what can we learn from this historical character, Sophie?
Yeah. Actually, I think about the quote that I read up from this former Black Mountain College attendee who says, well, it's a question of what you're going to do in the world. Are you going to make a difference? And I think that's independently in what time. I mean, of course, that was a special time. It was a post-war, the 60s. It had already been some time since the Second World War ended, but it was it had come to a point where a lot of things were boiling together, and it was a special time. But today is also, maybe you could say that was a post-war, and now we in a pre-apocalypse time. But whatever time you're living in, you have to try to think that it's a moment. I used to have this life, you know, and it's a possibility, and you have to think how you can turn that around, and then it might. I mean, sometimes you're unlucky. You're in a place where you can't do what you want to do, and then you maybe have to quit and change place. Or if you can, change the place. And I think we're all, I'm grateful when I get described this context of living in the capitalist world that we do in a neoliberal society, and how incredibly difficult that is, and how many obstacles that are real, and that we have to all the time work with. But it doesn't mean that we can't, that he isn't possible, actually. I think he would be possible today. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can I add? I think it's important that when I interviewed Pontus in '96, he stressed very much that the museum here, Moderna Museet, which the concept that he and his collaborators developed with the multidisciplinary exhibitions and all this and all the radical things, and that he really stressed that this was actually a consequence of the Swedish society at this time in the 60s. That was a time of exceptional economic success for Sweden, and we also had an extreme leftist movement. I mean, in '68, in the election, it was Social Democrats had more than 50% of the votes, only time it happened. And we had a male network of bourgeois leftist politicians and administrators, all male, unfortunately, but led by Olof Palme. Pontus stressed this, that supported very strongly what they were doing here. And so it was, and he stressed that it was, the museum was a result of this extraordinary social experiment that was the Swedish welfare society. So that was a product of a unique time, I think. And he also talked that already in the 70s, early 70s, he realized that this time had passed, and the utopia that they envisioned there, that the time had already passed for this, unfortunately, and that made him very disappointed.
Gitte?
Yeah, I think being a state museum, we of course we are living on that legacy with other challenges, and I think there's a lot more resistance within the institution today. That the politics and the institution in general are not like aligned today in the same way as they did. And to be an art institution today, it's a pluralistic thing. We do it in a very different ways. But I wanted to add to this, thought experiments of would we, how would he act today? And I think what is important for me is to abstract or extract his thoughts. It's not about the way that it worked in the 60s. Yes, it was easier to make an exhibition. Yes, there were 20 employees. Today we are 200. We have 140,000 works in the collection. So of course it's a different way today, and the whole art market has changed dramatically. But what is still vibrant is the idea of a museum not only be an empty container for art. And when you enter the museum, you enter a space where artists and art work in a very, very special context, namely the context and the platform where art meets the public. And I think that, to me, my inspiration in my daily work is to bring that legacy with me, to always be aware that this is like a third format where we can constantly experiment. I think what is different from now, from that time, is that we are extremely aware of us writing both history and art history, and that we have an obligation to constantly correct what have been done in the past, and constantly to add on. So there's a huge historical acknowledgement among museums today that I'm not sure it was so present at that time. There one acted more spontaneously, and I think it's that gives us a large responsibility in diversify our collection and diversify also our public. And something we talk a lot about today is how the importance of really taking seriously that if we are to seen as an educational platform for the public, we have to meet a public in a way that we are on the same level, so to speak. And I think that's what differs also from today. But the core of his thoughts are extremely present in our daily life.
Thank you. Jean-Hubert, you who knew him, would you say that he would think that he could find a place in today's museum?
Sorry, that he could find a place?
That he could see himself. Yes, I will apply for this job because it's available. Or would you think like the museum structure of today is not for me?
No, there are always possibilities everywhere. Yeah, of course. Well, I just want to go a little bit further. The problem for museums is always the visitors. How with which public do we work, and who are the visitors? Can we enlarge this circle of visitors and maybe touch other people? And this was, I think, what was really very important from Pontus, and where we have, and I'm sure you think of that all the time. But I think we do it probably in the wrong way. I mean, the problem is that we have followed so much art history that we have all these specialized museums. You know, we have the Museum of Fine Arts with the ancient painting, and then we have all sorts of decorative arts museum, and the Museum of Modern Art, and the Museum of Contemporary Art, which is younger than the modern art, and so on and so on. And we have now to maybe to get rid of that, you know. And well, you know, when you think of France and the museums that we created at the after the French Revolution, most of them were directed by artists. And when art history started in the second half of the 19th century, art historians just confiscated the jobs, you know. And for France, it was a catastrophe, because during almost 1 century, they were always rejecting everything that was avant-garde and innovative and so on. And I think we have to look at things completely differently. Sorry to talk about my own exhibitions, but what I've done recently started in Paris with an exhibition at the Grand Palais called Carambolage, but afterwards I was asked to do this carte blanche exhibition at the Museum Pushkin, and recently at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva. And I just work with all the stuff they have in the collection without hierarchy, and just trying to make exhibitions that are made with visual analogies that anybody can understand, can check, can see, because it's about just seeing, having feelings and emotions, if possible. And these feelings and emotions should then make the public curious enough to afterwards look at Wikipedia. Everybody can have the knowledge nowadays on his iPhone, you know, and not having all these enormous texts, you know, at the entrance of every exhibition. And if you haven't understood that, you're not allowed to understand the exhibition, you know. We treat very often the public as real children instead of taking them as adults. And I think that a work of art should be looked and judged at by anybody with his system of reference and not ours as scholars and specialists and whatever.
So you think that we're not taking the public seriously enough? Or
no, we certainly take the public seriously, but we can increase maybe the public and gain another amount of people to come to the museum and see something, not only through the eyes of the art history.
Marta, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind us of that when he starts out, there are almost no modern museums. There are the MoMA. But this is the 50s is the period where the idea of this starts out as exhibitions. 1948 Venice Biennial and the 1950 are examples of exhibition. You know, the national pavilions and the national exhibitions, but then they're also starting to show exhibitions on the historic avant-garde in order to rehabilitate after the Nazi regime. And this is the project of all the 50s, to educate people on modern art. So in that sense, they are part of a much bigger project of introducing modern. So in a way, it's part art educational project, and especially in Sweden, with this idea of cultural democracy. But it also, so there's a sort of a period where we are now is a different context or different situation. The 1955 Documenta is the first real presentation that is a total exhibition dedicated to modern art. So it sort of, he's part of that process. So where we're sitting now didn't exist.
So if the Modern Museum is a part of trying to make also as a kind of an idea of democracy and bring the idea of democracy back to the people. Kim, you were saying that you envision a new idea of the museum as a place for democracy. It's kind of the same idea, but in a different shape. And then I think that when we're talking about Pontus Hultén and this, the metaphor kind of resembles very much the idea of the computer with the storage and the mill, and also cybernetics. I know you're writing about this too. But today we have computers and we have Twitter. So I mean, what kind of metaphors do we need for understanding the new museum?
Well, okay. So two things. First of all, I would say that the media platforms through which we communicate today and that we somehow relate to very much when we think about the new social role of digital media and so on, they are fundamentally not democratic. So to somehow align or combine the institution of the museum today with that structure would be catastrophic. Very, very bad idea. Don't do it. Okay. But then I was thinking about something else, and perhaps it touches upon this thing. Several people have. I mean, this question, which is a very funny question that you ask about, the resurrection of Pontus Hultén. If we could somehow clone him or something and bring him back today, and so what would happen? And as many have pointed out, I mean, it's the historical situations are wildly different, and so it's a crazy anachronistic notion, but it's also, as I think Jean-Hubert mentioned, it's also the difference of scale. Because what were you thinking about? We're thinking about this image that Andreas showed with Pontus Hultén, the museum director of this institution, helping paint and pull apart she. Huh? Maybe Gitte doesn't do this, right? But on the other hand, a director or let's say someone involved in directing or organizing an autonomous artist-run, art center. For this is every day. Huh? It's evident. That's what happens. So in that sense, there are Pontus Hulténs everywhere. And also, I guess in a way, another thing that's been coming back here is the change in economic conditions. And in a sense, we're going to go look at the study gallery, in a way. And I would say the museum has, in a way, been taken hostage by their collections. There's so much value involved in these collections that have been built over the decades that it's impossible to even envisage at a museum of this scale and with this kind of status and so on that kind of wild experimental activity that was going on.
But if you look in Paris to the Palais de Tokyo, for instance, it was created exactly for that purpose, for that goal. It's a half a ruin, and they can do anything there, and it works. The artist seems to be quite happy when they come there, and the curators very often also help doing things.
I've also painted when I was a curator, many times.
I guess what I find maybe historically quite different, in addition, just kind of piggybacking on what Kim was saying, is that when I think about the activity of a curator or a museum director acting as a curator, acting as an artist, I would see that as actually quite ethically, it would have a high potential for being problematic. Because of a potential abuse in power. And I think that that's something that we haven't really spoken that much about in the context of Hultén, in the sense that actually when I was listening to your panel conversation and you were positing him as a potential artist by carrying around these artworks, I thought he looked actually more like a producer to me, that he was just carrying stuff around and maybe installing it. And as a curator, I oftentimes work as a producer or as someone who sweeps the floors or takes tickets and stuff like that. And it reflects, for me, an ethical position of a lack of hierarchy with support staff. And I don't think it's very difficult to do that. It's a very fine line. And I guess I do wonder what the role was with Hultén in terms of thinking through these ethics. And also, if you look at, let's say, a negotiation between a museum director and an artist, the museum director is always going to win, no matter what. That's just how it works. So it's by nature an uneven relationship. So I just also wanted to point that out, and I also wanted to respond to something that Kim said that I totally disagreed with, that I don't think that the history of institutional critique necessarily is one of negation. I think it's actually one based on love and care, based on the fact that if you want to hold something accountable, it's based on an admiration for it. So that's how I also look at the practices surrounding institutional critique. It's not necessarily about wanting to destroy something, it's actually about this kind of insider position of wanting to create change.
I think the museums evolved enormously according to the necessity given by the artists in the last 50 years. Enormously. They have adapted. So
yeah, I think that's a good point, that like maybe on a meta level that there have been professional developments that have changed the nature of institutions. I'm talking more about in a specific social engagement scenario in which one-on-one, like that's always going to be a very charged situation between a director and an artist. And also the idea of even like Hultén getting some credit to create the work of Nikki de Saint Phalle. I mean, there's also an enormous gender dynamic present in that, I have to say.
Annika?
I suppose it's fundamentally so that the social welfare fair was the condition of what was going on in the 60s. And I think the question about the future, I don't want to end this conversation with a negative note, but I mean, it's clearly different to be, I suppose, a museum director under fascism than under a social welfare state, and it will create new challenges in a way. It's who owns the institution, who governs it, and if we are very liberal in the definition of an institution and also point to the possibilities to work in smaller unit, that's another thing. And I think most of us still are working in institutions and maybe should have this old leftist note of durch die Institution, and wherever you are, you just try to do what's possible. But to be Pontus Hultén under fascism, I don't know.
No, maybe it's not.
So,
Andreas?
Yes, just a short answer. I was probably a bit unclear. You see, my point was exactly this, that he did not want to be an artist. He wanted to be in charge and have the power. And the images I showed was, I think, an example of he performed in that sense, and it was also part of a project to make this catalog that was very well planned with this exceptional photographer. So my point was that he wanted to be in power. Still, he liked to hang out and so on. So, and to be a part with his work with his friends, but still, I mean, that was my point actually. Yeah.
I think the last word, Gitte, is yours.
Thank you. I was actually responding to something about the relationship between this power relationship between the artist and the museum as an institution. And I think the question that is interesting today is also how the institution that grew out of Moderna Museet in the 60s has also transformed the art. And that was like, in my opinion, that was like the first wave coming in the 50s and 60s. And with the example of Hun, which was like the dynamics between those two changed the idea of what an artwork is. And the second wave came with the Tate Modern around year 2000 with the great turbine hall that created this gigantic idea of an immersive works of art. And artists were given the possibilities to really, and have the funds to do it. So in that sense, as an institution today, to work with anti-institutional art is what we question. When we put down our program, we are of course curious also in the art that challenges us as an institution. And how do we do that without institutionalizing it? So I think that was some of the things at stake in the 60s. And in a more playful way, how can we change this dynamic of power, and how can this, brutalize one another? So I mean, we have to learn from the past constantly, and how we take this into our own time. Yeah.
Well, I think that concludes the panel for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Again, thank you, the panel, the participants, and we have heard a lot about on the legacy of Pontus Hultén and the future of the Modern Art Museum. I would like also to thank you to the audience. You have been fantastic, and I'm so happy that we have been so many here today discussing and listening and talking about Pontus Hultén and Moderna Museet and a lot of other things. Now, to conclude, if you are interested, you're very welcome into the Pontus Hultén Study Gallery next to the auditorium, and we will see if the machine can work. Okay, thank you for today.